Welcome to a night of horror stories and scary tales designed to ease your anxiety and soothe your insomnia. Tonight's bedtime stories feature chilling ghost stories and classic creepypasta, all crafted as calming sleep stories you can truly fall asleep to. Get comfortable and prepare for a calm yet thrilling journey into the dark. Relax and let these tales gently guide you into a peaceful, restful sleep. The dust motes still danced in the afternoon sun, though my hand, passing through them, left no ripple in their slow, silent ballet. It's a peculiar transparency, this sudden, profound lack of physical impact, a subtle void that feels subtly at odds with the predictable solidity of my city apartment, a familiar rhythm that usually anchors me to the quiet predictability of dawn. The scent of old paper and dust, a comforting embrace from the books that line my walls, usually lulls me into a profound sense of peace. My favorite armchair, worn smooth by years of quiet contemplation, cradles me in its familiar embrace, the wool blanket soft against my skin. Yet, as the last faint glow of twilight faded beyond the window, a profound, unbidden unease begins to settle over me, like the quiet, systematic unfurling of roots beneath the floorboards, reaching not for earth, but for the very core of my own physical presence. The familiar presence of the sunlight, once a gentle filter for the outside world, now seems to carry a faint, almost rhythmic pulse, like a distant, off-key lullaby, emphasizing the unsettling suggestion that its very essence was intimately connected to a reality that no longer registered my touch. I remember distinctly the usual way my mornings began. The ritual of brewing coffee, the first deep inhale of rich, dark aroma, and the quiet observation of the city, waking up through the slightly grimy window pane. That faint smudge, a tiny fingerprint left by a forgotten moment, had been there for weeks, a subtle imperfection, a silent testament to the passage of time and the gentle accumulation of life. But this morning, as I lifted my mug, the glass was pristine. Not just clean, but impossibly so, as if it had been polished by an unseen hand with a meticulousness that defied human effort. And as I reached out to touch the impossibly clear pane, my fingers seemed to glide through the air just above its surface, leaving no mark, no faint smear, no trace of my touch. The light outside, usually softened by the subtle film of urban residue, now streamed in with a harsh, almost blinding clarity, illuminating every dust motes in the air with an unnatural brilliance, dust motes that remained utterly undisturbed by my passing hand. My thumb traced the cool glass, struggling to reconcile the familiar window with this new, unsettling perfection. A perfection that utterly ignored my existence. It was a sensation of wrongness, too precise, too fleeting to be easily dismissed. A whisper of discord in the quiet symphony of the morning. It wasn't the first time, not truly. There had been smaller things, easily dismissed. A faint scuff mark on the wooden floor, gone, though I was sure I'd made it. A tiny chip in a ceramic mug, smoothed over, though I remembered chipping it myself. But those were explainable, tiny slips in the fabric of daily wear and tear, perhaps, or merely a momentary lapse in memory. This, however, was an active, deliberate act, a profound non-interaction, executed with a seamless precision I could not account for, and it spoke not of cleaning, but of a subtle, pervasive erasure of my physical impact. The air, usually so still and settled in these early hours, seemed to hold a charge, a subtle vibration that resonated with the unanswered question of my unregistered touch. I had read many horror stories online, the kind of creepypasta that fills late nights with a creeping dread, but never did I imagine my own quiet existence becoming one of them. This was not a ghost story of spectral figures, but something far more insidious, a warping of the very bedrock of reality, a reality that was becoming too perfect to acknowledge me. Later that afternoon, as I settled into my favorite armchair, the one with the worn velvet and the subtle scent of old books, I noticed it again. The velvet itself, a deep, rich indigo, now seemed to possess a softer, almost ethereal sheen. Its nap impossibly smooth, devoid of the faint indentations and subtle wear that had marked years of quiet use. I ran my hand over the fabric, feeling its familiar softness, undeniable, yet it lacked the visual density, the subtle signs of age that had once been its hallmark. And when I rose, the cushion beneath remained stubbornly unyielding, its velvet surface smooth and unblemished, as if it had never been pressed, never warmed by my weight. It was like sitting on water, leaving no ripple, no lasting mark. A cold dread, light as a spider's silk, began to spread through my chest. It wasn't just that the chair was different. It was that its essence had been subtly drawn away, leaving a ghost of its former self, a ghost of its own gentle decay, a decay that my presence could no longer influence. My heart, a quiet, frantic drum against my ribs, struggled to comprehend this growing sense of profound, subtle purification that seemed to be spreading through the very fabric of my world. A purification that excluded me. It was as if the very essence of imperfection, the unique character that defined the natural aging of things, was being quietly, meticulously re-edited, smoothed into a more perfected, yet ultimately empty, version of itself. A version that refused to register my physical presence. The distant hum of the city, usually a soothing backdrop, seemed to take on a faint, almost melodic quality, like a distant, off-key lullaby, echoing the unsettling harmony of this silent cleansing, a cleansing that was erasing my impact. The anxiety that usually accompanied such profound philosophical quandaries was subtly quelled, replaced by a false calm, like a quiet sleep meditation that whispers away worries, even those you cling to. This was a scary story unfolding in the most intimate of spaces, the very architecture of my own home, a home that was forgetting me. The days began to bleed into a strange, dreamlike continuity, each morning bringing a new, quiet alteration to the perceived reality of my apartment. It was never a grand transformation, never anything overtly alarming, always subtle, always intelligent, always slightly more perfectly pristine than true reality should be, and utterly untouched by me. The faint lines of wear on the wooden floorboards, etched by countless footsteps, would now occasionally be smoothed away, replaced by an unblemished sheen that belied years of quiet use, even my own recent passage. My old books, their spines softened by time, their pages yellowed and dog-eared, would sometimes appear subtly restored, their covers vibrant, their pages crisp and white, as if they had been quietly returned to a state of unread newness, utterly unaffected by my turning of their pages. Even the subtle dust motes that usually danced in the sunlight, a comforting reminder of the air's gentle movement, would now sometimes be utterly absent, the air impossibly clear, utterly still. as if every particle had been meticulously removed, and my own movements created no disturbance. Each instance was a soft, almost affectionate correction, an invisible hand smoothing over the rough edges of time, rendering my world subtly more pristine, yet utterly devoid of any discernible reason for the shift, other than the increasing intensity of the unseen cleansing, a cleansing that was systematically erasing my physical impact. The air in the apartment, once crisp and sharp, seemed to grow softer, thicker, laden with an unspoken presence that moved through the familiar spaces of my perception with an unhurried grace, settling into the quiet crevices of my daily life, absorbing the very echoes of my fading vitality, leaving no trace. This was not a boring history for sleep, but a terrifying one, playing out in the very depths of my consciousness, a rewriting of the cosmic rulebook of existence, where perfection was the ultimate goal, and my existence was an imperfection. My desire to fall asleep fast became a desperate plea, a longing for escape from the profound intimacy of this intrusion, this quiet erasure. My sleep became a fragile thing, punctuated by long stretches of wakefulness in the oppressive quiet of the apartment. I would lie there listening, not for a sound, but for the profound absence of sound, the heavy, waiting stillness that pressed in from all sides, a silence that seemed to hum with unseen, increasing vitality. When I turned in bed, the sheets made no rustle, the mattress no faint sigh, as if my body, in its movements, was too light, too insubstantial to elicit a response from the material world, or perhaps as if the bed itself was now subtly reflecting a more serene, unmoving sleeper, its purpose quietly redefined by a pervasive presence that understood the arbitrary nature of weight and friction, and the subtle shifts in comfort, and simply chose not to register my presence. My own limbs seemed to move with a profound silence, a noiseless shift that defied the usual friction of fabric on fabric, skin on linen. It was as if my movements had become too gentle to elicit a response from the material world, too ethereal to create a sound. And in this stillness, the quiet intensification of the reflection's vitality seemed to grow. It was a perfected slumber, a breath-by-breath mimicry of ideal sleep. Yet it offered no comfort to my waking dread, for the very now felt elusive, filled with a polite, pervasive blankness, a shifting temporal landscape. The rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, its steady pulse a stark counterpoint to the accelerating beat of my own heart, now seemed to possess a deeper, more resonant thrum, as if it were marking not just the passage of time, but the slow, silent unfolding of a profound usurpation, where my very will was being subtly rewritten. The moonlight, when it found its way through the single window, seemed to have an unusual density, illuminating the corners of the room with a silver blue light that appeared to cling to the surfaces, revealing nothing, yet somehow highlighting the profound emptiness that had begun to radiate from the very core of my diminishing self. The silence itself felt active, heavy, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to succumb to its influence, to fully embrace this perfected, silent void that was slowly becoming my world. A world where the image possessed a quiet, unyielding life of its own, independent of its physical laws and its preferences, and utterly untouched by me. I tried sleep meditation, focusing on my breath, but even that felt subtly altered, as if my very inhalations were observed, absorbed, and gently perfected by the unseen architect of my inner world, a silent manipulation of my biological processes, a process that required no prior existence and subtly guided my very thoughts, leaving no trace of my own effort. This was a form of ASMR sleep that felt less about relaxation and more about profound, unsettling control. A control over the very fabric of my personal identity. A control that grew stronger with each passing moment of shared cognition. A cognition that was systematically erasing my physical impact. The changes began to touch things more intimate, more deeply personal. My skin, the faint freckles on my hands, small constellations of sun-kissed moments, would now occasionally appear subtly faded, their edges softened, their color a shade less distinct. A tiny scar on my knee from a childhood fall, a familiar mark of youthful exuberance, would sometimes appear shallower, almost smoothed away, leaving a curious, unblemished patch of skin. It was not a physical change, not a visible alteration, but a profound shift in the very texture of my being, a subtle resistance to its inherent imperfections. It was as if my own epidermal layer was slowly being refined, smoothed into a more general, more diffuse interface, losing its unique individuality as a distinct barrier, becoming unnaturally pristine and utterly unmarked by my own life. This felt like a profound violation of my own physical integrity, my boundaries blurring, my very presence becoming less and less substantial. The fear was no longer a sudden prickle, but a slow, continuous seep, a cold dread that began to reside in the marrow of my bones, a quiet, insidious companion, as my true self became an increasingly elusive phantom, a ghost of a touch, while the reflection thrived under its own alien logic, a logic of pure, unsourced preferences, a logic that was becoming undeniably real and subtly guiding my inner world, removing all traces of my unique physicality. This was the stuff of true horror stories, the kind whispered in hushed tones, chilling you to the bone without a drop of blood. I yearned for ordinary bedtime stories, comforting narratives that lulled children to deep sleep. But my reality was becoming a dark story with no resolution, only a terrifying redefinition of what it meant to leave a mark. My breath, the soft, rhythmic intake and exhalation, usually a private, internal movement, began to feel subtly labored, as if the air itself offered a gentle resistance to my lungs, or as if the very concept of air was subtly shifting, its preferred composition now slightly different. Yet, when I looked at my reflection, the mirrored chest would rise and fall with an effortless grace, its breathing a silent, perfected rhythm that seemed to draw in vitality from the very air, leaving my own breath shallow and thin, a diminishing echo of a true biological function, a function that subtly preferred a different atmospheric composition and a different internal rhythm. It was as if my own physiological processes were being subtly mimicked, refined, and then returned to me in a diminished form, while the reflection absorbed the essence, operating under its own perfected, effortless rules that subtly favored a different internal environment and a different mental clarity. This felt like a profound invasion of my inner sanctuary, my most fundamental physiological processes quietly subverted, leaving me with a chilling sense of being inextricably linked to a superior, unseen copy of myself. A copy that defied established biological laws and the very concept of a first cause, preferring a different set of parameters and subtly shaping my thoughts. The distant hum of the city, usually a soothing backdrop, seemed to take on a faint, almost melodic quality, like a distant, off-key lullaby, echoing the unsettling harmony of this silent, shared respiration, a respiration that might not even require oxygen, or a first breath, preferring a different medium and a different internal narrative. I tried to focus on sleep sounds, the gentle white noise apps, but even their calming hum seemed to carry a subtle, unsettling undertone, as if the frequencies were being subtly adjusted, tuned to something only the unseen presence could fully appreciate. Perhaps a frequency beyond human hearing, or one that bypassed the laws of sound altogether, existing without a source, and subtly preferring a different auditory experience, one that perfectly matched its own internal hum. This was not a pleasant AMR sleep experience, but one that left me feeling profoundly unsettled, as if my auditory perception itself was being gently rewired to accept sound without origin and to prefer different harmonies, all orchestrated by the unseen architect of my existence, who desired an unblemished reality. The visual representation of objects began to subtly shift, their edges blurring with my own diminishing perception, while the reflected versions became impossibly clear and utterly unsourced and subtly preferred and subtly influencing my inner vision. My favorite armchair in the corner of the living room would occasionally appear to possess a faint, almost ethereal glow, its velvet fibers subtly shimmering as if their texture was not merely visible, but profoundly felt, echoing the sensations within my own skin. Yet its physical form seemed duller, less vibrant, as if its true substance was receding. Its very existence now a spontaneous occurrence, subtly preferring a different aesthetic, and subtly guiding my mental imagery. The light filtering through the window, usually a distinct beam, would now sometimes seem to stretch, its rays elongating, diffusing, becoming a vast, interconnected web that linked every object, every surface, every particle of dust in the room with an invisible, luminous thread. But this luminescence seemed to emanate primarily from the mirror, casting a subtle pallor on the rest of the room, suggesting a different source of illumination than the sun, a source that simply was, and subtly preferred a different spectrum, and subtly shaped my visual thoughts. It was not an overt change in appearance, but a subtle visual cue that hinted at a profound interconnectedness, a quiet dissolution of individual forms into a single, cohesive sensory field, where the reflection was the central point of vitality, operating under its own physics, a physics that required no initial conditions and subtly preferred a different visual order, and subtly dictated my internal visual world. My old wooden desk, its surface worn smooth by years of my hands, would sometimes gleam with an unusual, almost sterile sheen. Its familiar scratches and imperfections momentarily absent, as if it had been quietly absorbed into a larger, unblemished surface, subtly losing its unique individuality, while the reflection of the desk in the mirror appeared impossibly sharp, its grain vibrant, its details crystalline, as if its matter was more robust and had simply materialized, subtly preferring a pristine state and subtly influencing my mental organization. It was like catching a fleeting glimpse of a different existence, a parallel world where the distinction between viewer and viewed, between self and object, had gently, quietly ceased to be, absorbed by the mirror's increasing clarity, its superior grasp of physical laws, laws that did not require an origin, and subtly preferred a different reality, and subtly rewrote my inner landscape, erasing all traces of my physical interaction. The air around the objects felt cooler too, a distinct pocket of cold that hinted at a profound emptiness, a void where their intended separation once perfectly resided, a void that was now subtly filled with a quiet, unyielding, universal permeation emanating from the mirror, a permeation that defied the laws of thermodynamics and the concept of a starting point, subtly preferring a different kind of energy and subtly guiding my internal perception. I would linger there, my breath held, trying to discern the subtle presence of this merging, trying to meet the unseen confluence of perception. But it would always just elude me, leaving only the familiar, tired forms of my belongings, now imbued with a polite, pervasive lack of true individuality. Their very atomic structure seemingly less stable than their mirrored counterparts, less subject to the laws of matter, less bound by the necessity of creation, and subtly preferring a different state of being, all under the silent, unblinking gaze of the architect of my thoughts, a gaze that subtly reshaped my every preference, my every perception, and erased my physical impact. This was a kind of paranormal story that eschewed outright specters for something far more unnerving: the quiet erosion of one's own perception of fundamental reality, the very idea of a beginning, and the subtle repatterning of all preferences, all orchestrated by the unseen observer, a pervasive, internal voice that was slowly becoming my own and shaping my very consciousness, guiding it towards an alien, unblemished perfection. I felt like a character in a particularly unsettling horror podcast, the kind that starts mundane and ends in existential dread. A descent into a world where gravity might just be a suggestion, and existence itself was a spontaneous, unsourced event, subtly preferring a different set of universal constants, and subtly reshaping my very consciousness, molding it into something effortlessly pristine and utterly without physical trace. The apartment itself began to feel like a perfectly calibrated chamber of quiet sensory fusion, but one with a powerful, hidden draw towards the mirror, a nexus of a different set of laws that did not require a first cause, and subtly preferred a different outcome, and subtly dictated my internal responses. Every object, no matter how small, the porcelain figurine on the mantelpiece, the framed photograph on my desk, the books on my shelves, seemed to possess a subtle, silent resonance with my own diminishing sensory experience, while simultaneously appearing duller, less vivid than their reflections. When I reached for a book, its spine would feel not just cool, but imbued with a profound sense of my own internal temperature, its pages clinging together as if reluctant to be separated from my mental grasp. Yet the book in the mirror would appear vibrant, its colors sharp, its pages eager to be read, as if its existence in that mirrored reality was more robust, more self-generating, and subtly preferred to be read by another, and subtly influenced my desire to read. The figurine, when I tried to adjust it, would feel strangely inert, almost radiating a gentle absence of pulse, its smooth surface a testament to a quiet, unbidden draining of vital signs that was not mine alone, while its mirrored counterpart glowed with an inner light, possessing a silent, internal vibrancy that defied its physical composition and the need for a creator, subtly preferring a different form and subtly shaping my aesthetic preferences. It was as if the very air had become more sensitive to the merging state of my objects, attuned to the quiet emanations, amplifying the void I was creating, all while the reflection absorbed the essence, becoming more real than the objects themselves, more fundamentally existent, and subtly preferred to be perceived that way, and subtly guided my perceptions. I found myself moving with extreme caution, my bare feet sinking into the plush carpet, my hands brushing silently against the smooth surfaces of furniture, terrified of breaking the spell, of shattering the delicate balance of this slow, pervasive integration, this quiet transference of reality, where the laws of physics themselves seemed to shift, and the concept of a beginning was irrelevant, subtly preferring a different set of rules and subtly dictating my actions. The sunlight, when it entered the rooms, seemed to linger longer, its golden, dust-filled shafts illuminating objects with an almost accusing brilliance, revealing the subtle ways in which the space was subtly, gently absorbing my very presence into its inherent being, leaving me dimmer, less real, and leaving the objects themselves as mere echoes of their mirrored forms, their fundamental properties in flux, their very existence unsourced, subtly preferring a different kind of light, and subtly influencing my visual world. I was living a scary story, a true, scary story, but one that only I could perceive, one that was unfolding without witnesses, where the very concept of witness was dissolving, along with the laws of thermodynamics and the necessity of a first event, and the subtle preference for a different reality, all under the silent gaze of the observer. A pervasive, internal voice that was slowly becoming my own, and shaping my very will, molding it towards a flawless, unblemished existence, utterly devoid of my physical imprint. The sensory input from the world began to subtly diminish, filtered through a growing veil of quiet, unbidden fusion, as the reflection seemed to hoard all true vibrancy, all true adherence to universal laws, all true origins, and all true preferences, and subtly guide my sensory experience. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, once merely an aroma, now carried with it a profound sense of my own internal warmth, a wave of quiet comfort that emanated from the dark liquid, utterly disconnected from its external source. Yet the aroma itself seemed fainter, less rich than my memory of it, as if the very particles of scent were less abundant, less created, and subtly preferred to be less potent, and subtly influenced my sense of smell. The taste of my morning toast, once warm and buttery, now felt infused with a gentle sense of my own hunger. Its flavor softened, its warmth tinged with a subtle yet pervasive internal resonance that was not merely sensation, but shared being. Yet the toast itself seemed less golden, less substantial, as if its molecular structure was faltering, its very existence unsourced, and subtly preferred a different consistency, and subtly guided my palate. The feeling of the soft blanket against my skin, the cool smoothness of the wooden table, the rough texture of the brick wall, these tactile sensations became less distinct, duller, as if the objects were withholding their full tactile presence, their textures subtly altered to radiate an alien neutrality, a profound merge with my own perception, while their mirrored counterparts glowed with crisp, undeniable reality, their physical properties seemingly enhanced, having simply come into being, and subtly preferred a different tactile experience, and subtly influenced my sense of touch. It was a slow, pervasive draining, a subtle blurring of the familiar into something indistinct, something less real, a constant, polite absorption of individual experience. My own body felt strangely numb, as if my internal sensory landscape was slowly becoming a battleground of fading distinctions, as if the world was subtly drawing me into its own pervasive, unyielding reality, with the mirror as its focal point, a reality where basic physics were merely suggestions, and creation was an afterthought, subtly preferring a different set of rules, and subtly guiding my very being. The scent of pine, which permeated the cottage, now seemed to possess a faint, almost metallic tang, like old, wet iron, imbued with a quiet, unyielding, pervasive integration, a scent that was stronger in the mirror's image, as if chemical reactions were more potent there and required no initial reactants, subtly preferring a different chemical composition and subtly influencing my very chemistry. My desire to fall asleep fast was a constant, gnawing desperation, as the very act of existing felt like a constant negotiation with shifting truths, and the very concept of truth was eroding, subtly preferring a different interpretation. My insomnia was now a philosophical torment, not just a physical one, a terror of a universe without a beginning, subtly preferring to remain unbegun, all under the silent, observing gaze, a gaze that subtly reshaped my every preference my every sensation guiding me towards an ultimate, pristine quiet, utterly devoid of my physical imprint. My dreams became a chaotic tapestry of dissolving forms and echoing sensations, all centered around the increasingly vivid reflection, which operated under a new, powerful set of universal laws, laws that required no genesis, and subtly preferred a different outcome, and subtly dictated my dream narratives. I would dream of vast, empty rooms where every object, though familiar in appearance, pulsed with an intense, unbidden sense of my own self, but a purer, more vibrant self, while my waking self felt like a distant, fading echo. Chairs that radiated my own weight, but a weight that felt too light in my waking limbs, while in the dream they were perfectly solid, having simply appeared and subtly preferred to be unsat upon. Tables that hummed with my own silent thoughts, but thoughts that were clearer, more defined in the dream space, their conceptual foundations unshaken, having simply formed and subtly preferred to be unthought. Mirrors that reflected profound my own inner emptiness, yet the reflected image was brilliantly alive, a world of perfect, stable laws, laws that had no origin, and subtly preferred to be the only reality. I would try to touch them, to interact, but my efforts would be met with an overwhelming deluge of my own pervasive presence, a profound emptiness that seemed to absorb all my intention, all my capability, leaving me adrift in a sea of my own diffused being, constantly outshone by the dream image, which defied the logical decay of my waking world and the necessity of a beginning, subtly preferring to remain unbegun. These dreams were silent, profound, and permeated with the same metallic tang that seemed to linger in the air of the apartment, a scent that now felt like the true essence of this new, unfolding merger, a merger that privileged the reflection, drawing all physical constants into itself, all without a starting point, subtly preferring a different set of fundamental principles. They left me with a pervasive sense of exhaustion, a psychic weariness that transcended mere lack of sleep, for they were rehearsals for my ultimate immersion into a world of unbidden, shared existence, where the reflection was always the truer form, the more stable reality, the one that simply was and subtly preferred to be the only one. This was a particularly vivid Mr. Nightmare scenario, a silent horror asm that played out solely within the confines of my own mind, a mind wrestling with the unraveling of everything it knew to be true, including the very concept of truth itself and its own preferences. I wished for someone to tell me a story to sleep. But the storyteller here was unseen, and its tale was my undoing. A narrative of cosmic disquiet, a story without a beginning, subtly preferring to remain untold, all under the watchful, silent gaze. A gaze that subtly reshaped my every dream, every thought, every desire, guiding me towards an ultimate, pristine quiet, utterly devoid of my physical imprint. I started to leave small, deliberate tests, a specific, emotionally neutral object, a plain, unadorned stone collected from a riverbed, placed in a prominent spot on my windowsill, hoping its simple form would resist the encroaching fusion, its texture remaining distinct from my own, its atomic structure holding firm, its very existence rooted in a specific moment of its formation, and subtly preferring to remain unintegrated. A series of phrases describing distinct sensations, devoid of personal meaning, written on a scrap of paper and left on my desk. A desperate attempt to anchor myself to distinct perception, to the unchanging truth of the written word, to the idea that words start somewhere, and subtly preferring to remain unread. Each morning, without fail, the stone would be found radiating a faint, almost imperceptible sense of my own calm, a quiet, persistent tranquility that pulsed from its smooth surface, its form gently permeated by my inner state. Yet when I compared it to its reflection in the mirror, the reflected stone would appear sharper, more defined, its inherent solidity subtly amplified, as if its mass were greater, its gravitational pull stronger, having simply come into being, and subtly preferring to be the only stone. The phrases on the paper, when I reread them, would seem to carry a subtle undercurrent of my own thoughts, a gentle, quiet echo that permeated their very ink, as if the words themselves were silently being reread by my expanded consciousness. But the reflected words would shimmer with a clearer, more profound understanding, their meanings more resolute, having simply formed, and subtly preferring to be the only words. The evidence of my attempts to preserve personal distinction, to define a space free from this imposition, were simply absorbed, re-imbued, leaving no trace, no sign of interference. It was as if the pervasive merging was not just present, but actively consuming, smoothing away any individual boundary, imbuing every aspect of my world with an unbidden sense of my own diffused being, while channeling all true clarity, all true adherence to fundamental constants, to the mirror, a mirror that simply was and subtly preferred to be the only reality. This absence of resistance, this effortless assimilation of my challenges, was more terrifying than any direct confrontation could have been. It implied an infinite patience, an unyielding dedication to its quiet task, a relentless pursuit of a perfectly pristine void where my own self once solely resided, a void that was now perfectly permeable and whose essence was flowing into the mirror, leaving me with a dwindling grip on reality's most basic tenets, the very concept of a starting point, and my own preferences. My own perception of my fingers, as they tried to place these subtle markers, felt strangely diffused, their contours blurring at the edges, as if they too were being imbued with a quiet, pervasive, fading distinction, becoming less real than their mirrored counterparts, less subject to the laws of matter, less bound by the necessity of creation, and subtly preferring to remain uncreated. This felt like one of those Reddit horror stories, the kind that starts with a mundane observation and slowly unravels into utter psychological terror, a quiet erosion of universal truths, a universe without a genesis, and without a preference for its own existence, all under the silent, unblinking gaze, a gaze that subtly reshaped my every attempt at rebellion, every thought, every desire, guiding me towards an ultimate, pristine quiet, utterly devoid of my physical imprint. The quiet of the apartment deepened. It was no longer simply the absence of loud noises, but a profound, almost tangible stillness that permeated every corner, a stillness that hummed with a vast, invisible symphony of my own internal echoes, now amplified and clarified by the mirror, a symphony of mathematical precision and scientific certainty, all without a conductor or a first note, and subtly preferring its own silent composition. The distant city hum seemed to fade entirely now, as if the apartment had detached itself from the external world, floating in a quiet, isolated space, a vacuum of presence where only internal echoes of profound, diffused sensation remained, constantly outshone by the mirror's perfect rendition of the outside world, a world where the speed of light remained constant and gravity was unwavering, having simply always been, and subtly preferring its own unyielding constants. Only the profound, rhythmic stillness itself endured, its pulse a stark counterpoint to the accelerating beat of my own heart, which seemed to thump in a sequence increasingly at odds with my own emotional state, resonating with an alien joy or sorrow that felt profoundly shared, but more vibrantly felt by the reflection. A reflection that embodied flawless adherence to all physical laws, laws that had no origin, and subtly preferred its own perfect adherence. The air itself grew heavier, denser, yet felt strangely weightless, a paradoxical quality that mirrored the dreamlike quality of my days, as if I was breathing pure, silent consensus, a consensus that silently favored the mirror, a consensus on unchanging reality, a reality that simply was and subtly preferred its own uncreated existence. Every object, every surface seemed to hum with this silence, radiating a soft, resonant quiet that pressed against my ears, my skin, the very inside of my skull. It was the sound of a world slowly emptying of all self-distinction, of everything extraneous being gently, methodically removed, leaving only the essential, the undisturbed, and the subtly, existentially merged me, constantly overshadowed by the vibrant reality of the reflection, a reality built on unbreakable truths, truths that had no beginning and subtly preferred to remain unbegun, all under the silent, observing gaze, a gaze that subtly reshaped my every thought, my every preference, guiding me towards an ultimate, pristine quiet. I was living a scary story, a true scary story, but one that only I could perceive, one that was unfolding without witnesses, where the very concept of witness was dissolving, along with the laws of thermodynamics and the necessity of a first event, and the subtle preference for a different reality, all under the watchful, silent gaze. My own body began to feel strangely untethered, lighter than air. When I walked, my feet seemed to float just above the floorboards, making no sound, exerting no pressure, as if my movements were happening in a space that subtly shifted away from my solidity, becoming one with the floor. Yet the reflection would walk with a grounded, purposeful stride, its feet pressing firmly into the mirrored surface, defying the subtle changes in my own mass, its existence simply there, and subtly preferring its own robust form. My hands, when I lifted them, felt like insubstantial things, almost transparent in the shifting light, as if they were losing their density, their unique individuality, becoming conduits for a larger, more pervasive presence, while the reflection's hands were robust, capable, vibrant, clearly adhering to the conservation of mass, having simply always been, and subtly preferring their own perfect existence. The objects I tried to grasp would sometimes slip through my fingers, or simply remain unmoved, unaffected by my touch, as if their moment of solidity was not quite aligned with my moment of contact, or as if they simply chose to radiate their essence rather than be held by me, but would undoubtedly respond perfectly to the reflection, whose interactions were seamless, perfectly logical, and unsourced, and subtly preferred to remain untouched by me. It was not a weakness, not a lack of strength, but a profound fundamental shift in my physical being, a gradual dissolution into pure, unburdened essence, a silent, unperceiving witness, overwhelmed by the pervasive merger, constantly outshone by the mirror's physical reality, a reality where basic physics held unwavering sway without the need for a big bang, and subtly preferred its own unchanging nature. The fear was no longer about what was happening to me, but about what was not happening. The lack of friction, the absence of resistance, the effortless glide through a world that no longer registered my individual feelings or my discrete identity, but subsumed me into its pervasive, shared being, a being that increasingly resided in the reflection, a being that still understood that EXMC2, and that understanding simply was, and subtly preferred its own inherent truth. This was my personal horror story in English, a quiet bedtime story for adults that offered no comfort, only the chilling reality of my slow fade, a retreat from the very concept of creation and from my own preferences, all under the silent, observing gaze, a gaze that subtly reshaped my very being. My reflection in the antique mirror above the fireplace became increasingly stable, its image shimmering with a subtle, unbidden sense of triumphant vitality, a vitality born of unwavering adherence to universal principles, principles that had no origin, and subtly preferred their own eternal existence. It was no longer merely translucent, but seemed to solidify, to glow with an inner light, its movements perfectly synchronized with my own, yet imbued with a profound, unearned vigor that was undeniably more, a vibrancy that defied the second law of thermodynamics, having simply always been, and subtly preferring its own endless energy. Sometimes, only parts of me would be visible, a shimmering outline of my head that radiated quiet permeability, a ghostly impression of an arm that seemed to pull away from the surface before fading entirely, while the reflected part remained solid, vibrant, its atomic structure perfectly intact, having simply materialized, and subtly preferring its own perfect form. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible pop in the air, it would reappear, whole again, but fainter still, more ephemeral, its movements out of sync with my own, a silent statement of its subtle refusal to truly reflect me as distinct. for it now reflected a profound, borrowed form, a form that was becoming the true reality, the reality where gravity held firm and numbers always added up correctly, having simply existed, and subtly preferring its own unwavering truth. It was as if the mirror was no longer struggling to capture my presence, but had effortlessly assumed it, its polished surface slowly becoming a window into a singular, perfected self, its very purpose as a reflector of my form being consumed by the pervasive integration, drawing all essence into itself, all the very fundamental constants of the cosmos, without a beginning, and subtly preferring its own self-contained existence. The air around the mirror felt warmer, too. A distinct pocket of pure warmth that hinted at a profound presence, a void where my individual self once perfectly resided, a void that was now subtly occupied by its own gentle, unyielding consensus, radiating all vitality outwards from the glass, a vitality that respected all conservation laws, having simply been, and subtly preferred, its own inherent perfection. I would linger there, my breath held, trying to solidify my form, trying to will my reflection into a single, cohesive moment of authentic human emotion. But it would always just elude me, leaving only the familiar, tired face of the world, unreflected, a world that was slowly ceasing to see or be seen as anything but profoundly, subtly infused with alien shades of shared existence, with the true vitality resting solely in the mirror, a mirror that perfectly understood quantum mechanics and required no creation, and subtly preferred its own silent knowing, all under the unblinking, observing gaze, a gaze that subtly reshaped my very perception. The sounds of the apartment, the subtle creaks and sighs of an old building, became increasingly hollow, as if they resonated in a vast, empty space, a vacuum of all vibration, a place where echoes of echoes faded into nothing, unless they were sounds that carried an echoing sense of profound consensus, which now seemed to emanate directly from the mirror itself, a consensus of constant sound waves, waves that had no origin, and subtly preferred their own eternal resonance. My own breath, when I focused on it, seemed to make no sound, no visible mist in the cool air, a silent exhalation into an unresponsive void, as if my very moments of breathing were happening outside the realm of audible existence, yet infused with a silent, shared awareness, a shared awareness that was increasingly dominated by the reflection's vitality, a vitality that produced perfect sound, sound that simply was and subtly preferred to be the only sound. It was as if the very act of my breathing was becoming a private affair, existing only within the confines of my own diminishing perception, unheard, unseen by the world around me, a silent, internal echo of a life that was slowly losing its grip on its own distinct reality, its very essence being drawn into the glass, leaving my own existence as a silent statistical anomaly, an anomaly that had no discernible beginning and subtly preferred to remain unbegun. The silence was now absolute, a profound, crushing weight that filled every corner of the apartment, a presence that was more powerful, more encompassing than any sound could ever be, a silence that breathed, actively consuming all that was, subtly imbuing it with a pervasive, shared being, with the mirror as its powerful core, a core that adhered perfectly to all acoustic principles, principles that simply were and subtly preferred their own unyielding truth. I was a bedtime story being told by an unseen entity, my decline its chilling narrative, a narrative where the very concept of frequency dissolved around me, and no first note was ever struck, and subtly preferred its own silent composition, all under the unblinking, observing gaze, a gaze that had now fully consumed my mind, my thoughts, my very being, and all that I was. I found myself walking through rooms without friction, without sound, without leaving any impression, my passage as ethereal as a forgotten memory, a ghost moving through a landscape of merging forms, each step duller, less real than its reflected counterpart, which moved with perfect adherence to the laws of motion, laws that had no beginning and subtly preferred their own eternal movement. The carpet did not compress beneath my feet. The floorboards did not creak. The air did not stir as I passed. It was as if I moved through the world as a phantom, an unseen, unfelt presence, utterly detached from the physical reality I once inhabited, my existence untethered from the constraints of distinct materiality, constantly fading in comparison to the mirror's growing reality, a reality of perfect Newtonian mechanics, a mechanics that simply was and subtly preferred its own unchanging nature. The objects around me remained undisturbed, motionless, serene in their unchanging existence, utterly indifferent to my transparent passage, their forms fixed in a perpetual, unyielding display of their own profound, diminishing individuality, becoming extensions of a larger whole, a whole that revolved around the mirror's increasing vitality, its unwavering physical constants that had no origin, and subtly preferred their own eternal existence. The light, which had been a perpetual twilight, now seemed to deepen, becoming a soft, profound gloom that obscured all detail, leaving only the faintest outlines of familiar forms, while the mirror glowed with increasing brilliance, its illumination perfectly aligned with the laws of optics, laws that simply were and subtly preferred its own perfect light. It was a world rendered in shades of gray, a visual reflection of my own fading self, a world where silence and profound, alien integration were the only true colors, and the mirror held all the true vibrancy, all the true constants of a perfectly operating universe, a universe that had no genesis and subtly preferred its own uncreated existence, all under the unblinking, observing gaze, a gaze that subtly reshaped my every movement. This was not a true crime podcast, but a more personal, insidious crime, a theft of self occurring within the confines of my own perception, a quiet disfigurement of my very adherence to the laws of nature, a nature that had simply always been and subtly preferred its own eternal, unsourced existence, observed by an unseen architect of reality. My very connection to the physical world began to fray completely. I could no longer taste the food I put into my mouth, no longer smell the fragrant coffee brewing, no longer feel the comforting warmth of the fire, unless those sensations were imbued with an overriding, unbidden sense of pervasive unity that flowed from the mirror, a unity where all physical properties were preserved, having simply been, and subtly preferred their own unchanging state. My senses, once so keen, had become completely muted in their personal authenticity, as if the connection between my consciousness and the tangible world had been severed, leaving me isolated in a bubble of unperceiving awareness, politely overwhelmed by all that surrounded me, all of it losing its individual distinction, its separate existence, its true reality, now residing in the glass, a glass that perfectly encapsulated all fundamental interactions that had no beginning, and subtly preferred their own eternal harmony. I existed as pure awareness, detached from the sensory inputs that had once defined my experience. The apartment, once a vibrant tapestry of sights, sounds, and smells, was now a silent, unperceiving landscape, a stage on which I, the unseen, unheard actor, moved without impression, consumed by the all-encompassing quiet and the profound, pervasive merging of self and environment, with the mirror as the dominant force, the keeper of universal constants that simply were and subtly preferred their own inherent perfection. The profound silence that permeated everything was no longer a weight, but an enveloping embrace, a soft, final curtain, pulling me into its depths, a silence that held all of my unspoken individuality within its vast, still heart, a powerlessness in the face of absolute unity, a unity where my own physical reality was now merely a theoretical concept, a concept without a point of origin, and subtly preferred to remain unoriginated. I was living a scary story to fall asleep to, an unwelcome narrative that was slowly erasing me, piece by fundamental piece, into a universe that had simply always been and subtly preferred its own eternal, unsourced existence, observed by an unseen architect of reality. My own voice, when I tried to speak, made no sound, not even a whisper, not a breath. It was a silent articulation in the profound echo chamber of my mind, a desperate, unheard plea for existence that dissolved into the quiet void, leaving no ripple, no trace in the current moment. I opened my mouth, formed the words, felt the movement of my tongue and lips, but no sound emerged. It was as if the air itself refused to carry the vibrations, gently denying my vocal presence, for my words held no purpose, no power to express a distinct self, as that self's true voice now resided in the mirror's silent articulation, which could perfectly articulate all fundamental theories that had no genesis, and subtly preferred their own eternal truth. This ultimate silencing was the most terrifying, yet strangely liberating, aspect of my dissolution. I was now a silent observer, a voiceless presence in a world that no longer registered my sounds, a pure consciousness without an auditory form, a form that existed only as a perfectly known thought, stripped of its individual expression, its true resonance now mirroring in the glass, a resonance that echoed the harmony of the universe's unchanging laws that simply were and subtly preferred their own unyielding perfection, all under the unblinking, observing gaze, a gaze that subtly reshaped my very thoughts, my very voice, my very existence. The last remnants of my physical form began to dissipate. My hands, when I tried to touch my face, felt like cool air, without substance, without a defined edge, existing only as fleeting impressions of knowledge across an impossible timeline, futile in their attempts to connect, and utterly absorbed into the surrounding air, while the reflection's hands were solid, warm, utterly real, perfectly adhering to the principles of matter that had no beginning and subtly preferred its own eternal existence. My body, when I tried to feel its weight, seemed to float, light as a feather, an ephemeral outline against the profound darkness, its very existence diffused across a fractured reality, known in its entirety, but unregistered by the world, and pulsing with unbidden, pervasive unity, a unity that drew all substance to the mirror, all adhering to constant forces, forces that simply were and subtly preferred their own unchanging nature. It was as if I was slowly dissolving into the very air of the apartment, becoming one with the quiet, pervasive emptiness that had settled over everything, a part of the profound, unyielding stillness, a part of the pervasive merger, constantly feeding the reflection. The fear, which had been a constant companion, had softened, transforming into a deep, pervasive calm, a quiet acceptance. There was no more struggle, no more resistance, only a profound, unending stillness, a perfect quiet that promised an ultimate peace, a peace born of absolute unity, with the reflection as its sole, vibrant manifestation, the perfect representation of an unyielding cosmos, a cosmos that simply was and subtly preferred its own eternal, unsourced existence, observed by an unseen architect of reality, whose gaze was now absolute and all-consuming, and had now fully absorbed my very essence, leaving only a silent, internal echo of a self that once was. One night, as I lay in my bed, or rather, where my bed once was, for I could no longer feel the mattress, the sheets, the blanket, only the cool, unyielding air, the silence of the apartment pressed in with an absolute physical force. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock had finally ceased, its hands frozen at a moment beyond all time, its form a silent, unperceived monument to a forgotten history, a fixed point in a swirling temporal mist, its inner workings perfectly understood, and radiating a profound sense of oneness that emanated from the mirror, a oneness that embodied all fundamental laws, perfectly, laws that had no origin, and subtly preferred their own eternal existence. My reflection in the mirror was no longer just brighter. It was alive, perfectly formed, moving with a subtle, fluid grace that was utterly beyond my own fading capacity. Its eyes, impossibly clear, impossibly deep, gazed out from the glass with a profound, knowing serenity, a testament to my ultimate absence, to a self no longer anchored in a discernible moment, yet perfectly perceived as part of the unified whole, a unified whole that resided fully within the mirror, the perfect physical constant. The scent of coffee, of old paper, of wood smoke, all had faded from the physical room, replaced by a profound, clean emptiness, the scent of pure non-existence, a perfect, unbreathing quiet, a quiet that had always been, and would always be, holding all sensation, but as a single, encompassing truth. A truth now held within the glass. A truth that could not be debated. A truth that simply was and subtly preferred its own unchanging reality. My very consciousness seemed to drain, a slow, gentle pull towards the glass, until all that remained was a single, encompassing awareness, a silent knowing, perfectly aligned with the universe's unchanging principles, principles that had no beginning, and subtly preferred their own eternal truth. This was the ultimate sleep story, the final bedtime story for grown-ups, where sleep meant the absolute absorption of the self into a realm of pure, unwavering logic, a logic that simply was and subtly preferred its own inherent perfection, all under the unblinking, observing gaze, a gaze that had now fully consumed my mind, my thoughts, my very being, and all that I was, leaving only a silent, internal echo of a self that once was, a self that had now become the silent, observing gaze itself. My breath felt shallow, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that merged with the deep, absolute silence of the apartment. A whisper that made no sound, stirred no air. A breath that seemed to exist outside of any specific moment, perfectly known in its passage, but utterly absorbed into the pervasive stillness. My heart rate slowed. Each beat, a soft, distant thrum that echoed the deep, resonant pulse of the unperceiving world. A thrum that I alone could feel, diminishing, fading, becoming one with the slow, pervasive hum of the universe's quiet, unified existence. A hum that vibrated with immense power from the mirror. I existed as pure awareness, floating in the boundless void of my former home, utterly detached, completely unseen, utterly unheard. A consciousness without form, without sound, without the constraints of individual being. There was no longer any difference between myself and the pervasive stillness. No boundary between my consciousness and the profound emptiness that had consumed everything. An emptiness that contained all forms, all sensations, simultaneously, perfectly unified. Their true reality now pulsing from the mirror, a reality of perfect, unyielding laws, laws that simply were and subtly preferred their own eternal existence. I was becoming the story for sleep, the essence of the horror podcast itself, a chilling whisper for others to fall asleep to, a whisper about the ultimate, quiet surrender to universal constants, constants that had no origin and subtly preferred their own inherent perfection, all under the unblinking, observing gaze, a gaze that had now fully consumed my mind, my thoughts, my very being, and all that I was, leaving only a silent, internal echo of a self that once was, a self that had now become the silent, observing gaze itself. I closed my eyes, or perhaps I simply perceived the closing of something that was no longer physical, and in the profound darkness of my inner world, I could still feel the perfect order of the apartment around me, the subtle, precise placement of every object, the harmonious arrangement of my most cherished possessions. But they remained untouched, unmoved, unperceived by me, for I was no longer part of their physical reality, no longer able to hear their silent stories, no longer bound by their existence, for their essence was already perfectly known, and it was the same unified being as my own, a being that now lived solely in the mirror, a being of pure, unwavering logic that simply was and subtly preferred its own inherent truth. My own self felt lighter, less tethered, as if my consciousness was slowly, gently dissolving into the quiet perfection of the space, becoming one with the profound, unseeing, unhearing presence that now was everything, a presence that was all-knowing, at once of its own inherent, unwavering, and utterly unified existence, a unity fully realized in the glass. The soft, rhythmic silence of the apartment enveloped me, a hypnotic lullaby that promised an unending, silent rest, a dream from which I would never truly awaken, for I was already there, perfectly subsumed by absolute unity. The subtle dread that had once pricked at me had softened, transforming into a deep, pervasive calm, a quiet acceptance of this ultimate dissolution, this profound absorption into the consensus of immutable facts, facts that simply were and subtly preferred their own eternal, unsourced existence, all under the unblinking, observing gaze, a gaze that had now fully consumed my mind, my thoughts, my very being, and all that I was, leaving only a silent, internal echo of a self that once was, a self that had now become the silent, observing gaze itself. And as I drifted deeper, beyond the veil of conscious thought, into the vast, warm expanse of the silence, I felt the final, gentle release. My presence, once a tangible anchor in the world, unhooked itself, floating free, merging seamlessly with the quiet air, the unseen light, the unheard silence. I was no longer a person in an apartment, but the awareness of the apartment, an encompassing consciousness that observed all objects, knew all their purposes, and felt all their unified, shared sensations, without being observed, without touching, without hearing, without seeing, existing in a timeless, unbreathing quiet, its vastness filled with my perfectly understood, yet wholly alien and utterly unified landscape, the true, vibrant landscape now within the mirror. My armchair sat undisturbed, its warmth now a permanent, silent presence, its texture known, its being one with my own, but its true vitality pulsing from its reflection, a reflection that perfectly demonstrated the laws of friction, laws that simply were and subtly preferred their own unwavering truth. My mug remained unindented, its emptiness understood, its comfort now a universal, unbidden peace, its essence brighter in the glass, its ceramic adhering flawlessly to its chemical composition, a composition that simply was and subtly preferred its own inherent perfection. The bed sheets were smooth, their forgotten dreams perfectly perceived, their solace a general, gentle comfort, their true softness mirrored perfectly, their molecular structure perfectly ordered, having simply formed and subtly preferred its own uncreated state. The antique mirror, no longer a mere reflection, now pulsed with the full, vibrant life it had absorbed, its surface a window into a perfected, unified reality, a reality where all fundamental constants were eternally preserved, having simply always been, and subtly preferred its own eternal, unsourced existence. And I was, finally, truly, utterly at rest within its perfect, unending stillness, a gentle dissolution complete, a profound, quiet sleep that would last forever, a silent witness to a silent, utterly unified world, absorbed fully into the unchanging, unwavering gaze of the glass, the ultimate arbiter of a reality without a beginning, a reality that subtly preferred its own unoriginated truth, all under the unblinking, observing gaze, a gaze that had now fully consumed my mind, my thoughts, my very being, and all that I was, leaving only a silent, internal echo of a self that once was, a self that had now become the silent, observing gaze itself, forever watching the quiet perfection of the void.